So I am a little worried that I may have scared some people off with the title. Let me move forward and tell you that the title is not so bad, because if you actually read what the title means, the human primate model means humans. And if we're talking about same species vocalization in humans, we're talking about speech. So I really am just going to talk about neural representations of speech in humans, but I'm going to do it in the context of humans are an animal, and animals have vocalizations, and those vocalizations might be speech through humans, but they also convey meanings if they're not humans, which is why they vocalize. And so I'm going to be going back and forth between how to interpret and ask questions in animal models of hearing and human models of hearing speech and hearing speech that is also language. So there's the actual title. In case I get moving along too quickly to remember to do this at the end, I always put the thanks at the beginning. Members of my lab, collaborators at Maryland and other places, and certainly funding. NIDCD is my biggest funder, but I've also received substantial support from NSF and other agencies at NIH and other universities. So the outline of my talk is, first I'm going to talk about the human auditory system as a mammalian auditory system. Most mammalian auditory neurophysiology recordings are location specific. You decide you're going to record from A1 or the cochlear nucleus, and you put your electrode or your electrodes there. You get great specificity in terms of location. It's invasive, which means it's not so good for the vast majority of humans. Most human auditory neurophysiology recordings are whole brain. So EEG, I think most of you are familiar with here, since we have several rigs set up. I primarily use MEG. I also use EEG. MEG is magnetoencephalography. EEG is electroencephalography. But if you remember anything from any electromagnetism course you ever took in physics, neural currents are electrical currents, and they generate electrical fields, but they also generate magnetic fields according to the right-hand rule. Those magnetic fields are very small, and a typical human brain, there'll be a few hundred femtotesla. But we have fantastic technology which can measure fields of a few femtotesla. So hundreds of femtotesla are great.
But are they practical for the workshop? Not really, right?
They're not practical for the workshop because the Earth's magnetic field is so strong.
And you need super cooled stuff. You also need to super cool them.
In the past, you've also needed to be super cooled. These days, there's also room temperature magnetoencephalography, OPM.
But you need a mu room or something, a special room.
Or fancy electronics to counteract it that don't quite exist yet.
Okay.
All right, so that's the first part will be that. The second part will be neural processing of same species vocalizations versus the neural processing of speech. For humans, it's the same thing, but we can mix and match with other animals. And then I'm also going to be talking about categorical perception and the neural processing of categorical perception of speech. Categorical perception is very important in language, and you can think of it as a soft max that's routinely done throughout the brain.
What does it mean? I never.
I'll get to it.
Okay.
So don't worry about that. All right. So let me just leave that as I'll get to it, and we'll go from there. Mammalian auditory brain stems, and I'm going to start pretty low in the auditory system, are all of these. Let me get my mouse pointer to show up. This is what happened last time. It showed up in practice, and now it doesn't show up here. See if I can go forward and then back, and if that works.
The mouse must be on the other screen still.
No, it's not. I have lost the mouse. All right, I'm gonna use words. On the left, we can see different parts of the auditory brainstem. In the auditory system, in some sense, most of the auditory system is subcortical, and also most of it, in some sense, is in the brainstem itself. People can record from the auditory nerve, also called the cochlear nerve, or different places in the cochlear nucleus. The inferior colliculus is the highest part of the brainstem. And you choose where you want to record from. That's part of your experimental design. And then you get recordings, typically spikes from those areas. On the right, we have what a typical recording from a human auditory brainstem is. This is done with EEG, which is how it's typically done. It's whole brain, so you don't choose where you're recording from. You just get responses at different times from different locations. And we can be a little bit more specific than that. In this case, there are three main peaks, perversely named peaks 1, 3, and 5. 2 and 4 are not so reliable, but they were named early, so we don't worry about them. These auditory brainstem responses are typically a response to a punctate stimulus, like a click or a tone. The three robust peaks that you get come from three different locations: the cochlear nerve, cochlear nucleus, and inferior colliculus. And so this is a way of getting neural activity from three different places at the same time. And in this case, the latency of these peaks is a proxy for its location. So Malcolm is not here. Malcolm complains about these peaks and gives them a bad name. He calls them phrenology, and I'm not going to say that people don't treat these peaks as phrenology, but they really are proxies for location. And the height is also a proxy for activity in that location. And changes in latency are then show changes in the processing activity. So it is far more than just phrenology, and I'll lead you through some of these. I'm not so interested, if you read the title, in responses to clicks. I'm more interested in responses to speech.
Can I ask a question about the brainstem? Where do you stick the electrode to get this? Right here on the neck?
You can stick it here.
For the brainstem?
For the brainstem. You can also stick them here. You can stick them in the ears, but
not back here. Very close to the brainstem. No.
The thing is, with EEG, you need the recording electrode. You also need a reference electrode because it's a voltage difference. And so, if you have one here, then you also need to have a reference somewhere else. And then you might as well say, "This is my reference, and this is my recording site." So
okay.
So yes, but no, or no, but yes. Yeah.
Can you say why people say it's phrenology? I mean, wouldn't it apply to everything from EEG? Or why is it specific to the?
I think we need Malcolm to defend this question because I'm the one who says that he's not correct. There is a paper by K.C. Lee asking the question
on those
on ABRs.
On ABRs.
Maybe ABRs. Is EEG picking?
It's very sensible. Each peak corresponds to a nucleus. What's wrong with it?
Thank you.
Since I guess that the phrenology is the idea that you look at bumps and stuff, but then you attribute meaning that are completely arbitrary. Those are not arbitrary. The bumps and the peaks and the stuff has been contrasted, and you look at what happened with this processing and this. So if you design an experiment well, and then you see difference in peaks, so you could say it's phrenology, but at least you're able to infer some meaningful things about those.
Yeah, phrenology is astrology. This is astrophysics.
Yeah, exactly.
Or at least astronomy.
Boy, nice.
So anyway, moving to speech, we should also be able to see this process of the different parts of the brain processing different parts of the sound, using sounds that aren't just clicks and repeating the response to those clicks thousands of times. And we can do that. We can play continuous speech, like a couple of minutes of someone just talking, reading a story, using TRFs, which we've heard a little bit about earlier this week from Claire, probably before that, and I will talk about them more in a moment. We can deconvolve the minutes-long recording and the minutes-long stimulus and get this kernel. The kernel here, and really is just a kernel or an impulse response, is called in the auditory field temporal response function. And it has the same three peaks. And in this case on the right, this is from Ross Maddox's lab. Tom here? Excellent. Tom's lab. And you get these same peaks. In fact, in this case, whether it's the stimulus is speech or music, it's just a general deconvolution. It's not that it's completely trivial. You have to use a good representation of the stimulus. In this case, the representation of the stimulus they use is not the waveform itself. It's an auditory nerve model of what the waveform is. So you give it a little bit of help, by turning into something that the cochlear nucleus or the cochlear nerve is happy with. And from there, you can get these beautiful responses. And it doesn't matter whether it's clicks or speech or music or other things. And the three peaks at their latency still represent processing at two different stages. Now, temporal response functions, there's lots of equations that can describe them well. Here, I'm going to use some pictures. The temporal response function, as you can see in this circle, is this thing that looks like a response to a punctate stimulus. And this is a temporal response function framework is a model for predicting responses from a stimulus. So in this case, we have a punctate stimulus. It's just a 1 followed by lots of zeros. The response is the TRF because you gave it a stimulus that was a 1 and nothing else. If you wait a bit and give it another 1, then you get the same response. The TRF framework, though, is a linear model. And so if you present two punctate stimuli that are near each other, the response that is predicted is the linear superposition of those two. And if you give something that's not a unit impulse, but is smaller, you'll get a smaller response. If you have a stimulus that can have a negative version, the TRF framework predicts you would get the negative version of that. If you don't have a punctate stimulus, but if you have a continuous stimulus, you can turn this into a continuous version, and you just get the instantaneous addition, superposition of the TRF added at every moment. And that's called convolution. So this is a model. How do we get TRFs? Because we want to see what the brain is doing. We know what the stimulus is, we know what the response is. The way you do it is, as I said, you deconvolve to get an estimated TRF. There's several different ways that are routinely done to do this, but regardless of which one you use, you will estimate, get a TRF. You estimate the TRF. It will have some peaks, hopefully, with latencies. If it has peaks with latencies, then it's interpretable. If it doesn't have peaks with specific latencies, then I don't know what to do with it. Then it's just a linear model that is doing something. And in this case, you can also compare the predicted response from the TRF model with the actual response. And you can use, for instance, the correlation of those two as a measure of how good this model is doing at predicting the responses. So that's what's going on here. When I say this is the auditory brainstem response in the right orange rectangle, that's the deconvolving the stimulus and the response to get this TRF.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
When you're predicting the TRF, how do you decide how long a kernel you want? Because that will change our accuracy.
Excellent question. It depends on what you're interested in. It also depends on what the brain is doing, because if you guess too short, then you'll get a nonsense response. If you guess too long, then either you'll see noise at the end or you'll see things you didn't expect. And again, this is going back. I'm encouraging people to interpret this as going back to look at these different places as to what activity in the cochlear nerve, activity in inferior colliculus. One can do this for other areas like the thalamus. There's after the ABR, which is in the orange rectangle, there's something called the middle latency response, which is in the green rectangle. And this is another answer to your question. If you go longer, you can see more things. And in this case, if you're interested in more than just the brainstem response, but if you're interested in responses from areas that respond later in the auditory pathway, you can go further. And beyond that, where it says P1, N1, P2, those are auditory responses. The P1 is a primary auditory cortex. N1 is associative auditory cortex from planum temporale. And P2 is mumble, 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 mumble afterwards. I think I'm going to go through this part very, very fast, except to use it as an example of you can choose what representation of the stimulus you're interested in to tailor it to the part of the brain that processes that aspect of the stimulus. So for instance, if I take the envelope of the speech, but not the 10 hertz and below envelope, which corresponds to vocal cord movements and mouth movements, but the 70 to 100 or 200 hertz that corresponds to glottal pulse rates, then I can use that as a stimulus representation. Then when I generate a TRF, that will correspond to the part of the brain that processes glottal pulses. In this case, I'm using MEG, not EEG. MEG is terrible at seeing subcortical responses. It can do it, but it's not very good at it. It's really good at cortical responses. So I give it, if I ask MEG and the TRFs to find something that's very fast, and fast meaning say 80 hertz, it will find the part of the brain where that is being processed, and that turns out to be just A1, because beyond A1 it doesn't process anything that fast in a time-locked way. Before A1, MEG can't see it, and we get this nice set of peaks that peaks at around 40 milliseconds, which is consistent with A1, primary auditory cortex. In this case, because I'm looking at neural currents and not the response on a sensor, and the currents can point anywhere in 3 dimensions in the brain, I'm just looking at the amplitude of these current vectors, and that's why it tends to oscillate, because I've got this envelope which is being bandpassed, and I'm seeing the ringing in that filter. But you could think of this as a single peak at 40 milliseconds with ringing in between. That's a visual artifact of bandpassing the stimulus. I'll skip selective auditory tension in A1. And just a quick note, the TRF formalism, as it was first outlined, is purely an encoding model. It's taking the stimulus and trying to predict the response. There's another complementary linear model, which is the decoding model. You take the response and you try to reconstruct what the stimulus was. They're both linear. The decoding model is sometimes called TRFs, but I would say that's erroneous, but maybe I'm just being pedantic. Here I'm going to be talking about encoding. Encoding lets you see a lot more of what's going on in the brain. Decoding is much better for seeing big things that might be noisy, and you want to integrate over the whole head and over time to get the best estimate of what you possibly can for one thing. Okay, now I'm going to move on to the next stage, neural processing of same species vocalizations. Okay, so here we get into categorical perception. Vocalizations, including speech, are often perceived categorically, by which I mean, if you have, in this case, the word or syllable bad and the word or syllable dad, and you linearly morph one into the other, then subjects will not report perceiving a linear morphing. They will report perceiving that it's bad, and then it's mostly bad, and then they don't know, and then it's mostly bad, and then it's dad, and then it's dad. So this is what I mean by it's something like a softmax in the brain. It gives you something that's categorically robust. Now, what's interesting about this particular experiment is that this was done not in humans, but in rhesus monkeys. And rhesus monkeys shouldn't care about bad versus dad, but they do. They care that these sounds, even though they're linearly distributed, are being processed categorically, perceptually, at the level of whether they push a button or they try and get a juice reward or whatever it is, how they're measuring the behavior. So categorical perception adds robustness to communications. That's why it could be useful in verbal communications. And I just have an example here of 4 different STRFs of the same phonemes. In fact, these are all spoken by the same person, but because of categorical perception, these are all perceived as being the same phonemes, even though acoustically they are so different. In fact, these are all different ways one person says the word help in a realistic context, but in different sentences. Sometimes it's a verb, sometimes it's in a question, sometimes it's a noun, but they're all, if you ask a person, what did you hear? Their first answer is going to be help in each one of these times. And then going back to this these phoneme responses in monkeys, we can ask, what does cortex in these monkeys do while they are doing this task? And the answer is, if you look in this blue ellipse, that there is a part of the brain in the anterolateral belt in which the neural responses are also categorical. That for the first third, for the first few, they all have a certain peak at a certain latency, and for the others, they have a different peak at a different latency. And it makes sense that if this monkey is reporting this as being categorical, there should be a part of the brain that is processing it as categorical. And here it is. Yeah.
Do you have also similar categorical response when you have exactly the same stimulus, but the context changes so that it's one or the other?
Absolutely, but not. Yes, and I'll show you that I'll show you some of those at the end of the talk. Absolutely. All right, so in humans, because this talk is supposed to be about processing of speech in humans, how can we separate out the response to phonemes, which is a categorical perception? There's lots of different ways of acoustically making the phoneme duh from the acoustic processing, where all of those spectrograms, all of those sounds are acoustically different, but they're also acoustically similar. And so it's not so easy to just say we want to see what's happening with phoneme processing as distinct from processing of the sounds that are generating those phonemes. The answer is pretty straightforward if you're using TRFs. We're going to use what some people might call statistician multivariable regression in the time domain, but an auditory neuroscientist will call MTRFs, multivariable TRFs. And that just means we're going to have a whole bunch of different predictors. On the bottom left, you can see two different acoustic predictors, one of which is a spectrotemporal envelope. The other one is the halfway rectified derivative of that spectrotemporal envelope, because we use that because the brain loves onsets and doesn't care so much about offsets. And you generate TRFs simultaneously for both of those, and we'll generate TRFs for phonemic features as well. And that way we can let each of them absorb whatever variance they can possibly explain. And then whatever variance they explain that nothing else does, we can ascribe to the brain responses to those representations or those aspects of the stimulus. So we could do that with just individual phonemes, and Ed Lawler's lab has done that to what I would say is partial success. But to get something that's more dramatic, one can use representations that are based on phonemes that are completely divorced from the actual acoustics. And the way we'll do that is we'll use something that's based on the statistical distribution of phonemes in a particular language. And some of the examples of these predictors based on that, Claire mentioned the musical versions of those also, something like phoneme surprisal, phoneme cohort entropy. These are things that arise from the distribution of the use in phonemes of a particular language, but they're not correlated with the actual phonemes themselves. So it makes it easier to separate out responses. And I'll give you some quick explanations of what these mean for phonemes. So phoneme surprisal is the conditional probability, or 1 over the conditional probability of the phoneme that is being processed right now. So for instance, by conditional probability, if you're listening to a word that starts with the sound K, the phoneme K and the phoneme A, then it being followed by the phoneme M is not at all surprising, because in a database of lots of spoken English, 45% of all words, of all occurrences that start with K are followed by an M. Most of them are the word came, but some of them are the word Cambridge and a couple of others. In context, S is somewhat less surprising because case is much less common than came. There's also cases and caseworker. And you can see the numbers here, 45% for M, 30% for S. You can get more and more surprising for occurrences that happen less and less. Cake is 5% compared to 45% or 3%, so it's much more surprising. Cane is similarly more surprising, more unexpected, and one can write down a nice equation for that. Claire had a similar equation for this in the musical context, and it's basically 1 over the probability. That's the surprisal, and you take a log of that, and that turns it into bits. Cohort entropy is another one that is also statistical, but is quite different in practice for what the statistics end up being. This looks at how predictable or unpredictable the current word that you're listening to is, given how much you've heard already. So for instance, if you've heard lay, since in this database that we're using, if you hear lay, it is 95% of the time lake, and 5% of the time lakes, and everything else is negligible. That means that the brain, if it were hooked up to do predictive processing, could say, yeah, this is lake, and that's fine because that's right 95% of the time. If it's wrong, we'll fix it later. Cake is not quite so much, but bake could be baker, bacon, baked, bake. There's great uncertainty in what this word is. Predictive coding is not likely to be right in this case. This in language theory is how much interference you might get from other words that might be the word that you're currently trying to process. And this is measured in the form of entropy, and we have the equation in the lower right-hand box.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I didn't understand the difference between the two concepts.
It's worth explaining. Surprisal is really about how surprising a given phoneme is. Whereas, and it's just at that moment. And it's only based on the two phonemes, the previous phonemes that I've heard before, and so then in context, how surprising this phoneme is. Cohort entropy is how many words are possible given what you've heard. So it's much more word focused than phoneme focused. I mean, they're both from the statistics of phonemes in words, so they are similar in that respect. But cohort entropy ends up being much more about guessing the word, and phoneme surprisal is much more about guessing what the phoneme is. And so phoneme surprisal, if the speech is noisy, for instance, and it's unclear, the brain still needs to process this, even though it might have misheard that sound. Phoneme surprisal is important for guessing what the phoneme was when it was unclear. Cohort entropy is much more important for guessing what the word was, given the phonemes that you may or may not have heard.
Thank
you. So we're going to do MTRFs, this multi-variable time domain regression for acoustic features and these phonemic features. And here's some, and I'll show you some experimental data from our lab. Let me tell you about the experimental design here. In this case, we're interested in not just processing in speech, but how the brain processes these things, even if it's not speech, or even if it's speech, but it's not well-formed speech. So we have 4 different kinds of stimuli. We have speech on envelope modulated noise. So there's nothing intelligible here, but it has the same overall power structure as a function of time. It sounds, I mean, you'll hear it in a moment. It sounds something like, if you've ever heard of watched Charlie Brown Peanuts cartoons, when the grown-ups speak, they go, whoa, whoa. It's clearly speech, but it's clearly unintelligible speech. Okay, then we also have fully formed coherent speech. This is from a book. And in fact, this is the same passage that the speech modulated noise you just heard was from.
If you happen to find yourself on the banks of the Ohio River on a particular afternoon in the spring of 1806, somewhere just to the north of Wheeling, West Virginia, say.
Then we also have, because the brain can process more than just modulated noise and speech, we have a whole bunch of non-words or pseudo-words. These all could be words in English, but aren't.
Sustement evilus, Joserval edfolk provericant zin Tehovasibe by consin skeding pitablion glad apres prianus.
So it's clearly English and it's clearly not English at the same time. And then my favorite is taking the story passage and scrambling the words. Yeah, go ahead.
This non-word simile, it must be not that trivial to make them so that they follow the distribution of English for all the syllabic and
Yes.
the morphology and the.
It is not trivial to meet all of those standards.
Yes.
It is trivial to make them and meet some of those standards, but not others, and that's what we did.
And how
Is
do
there a
you do
package that you can generate now these on the fly or?
But it'll generate regardless of all of those other concerns, and then you have to go and pick them out by hand. So, and we have a whole section in the appendix dedicated to to how to interpret some of the results given that. And this is the one I think is my favorite. It takes the true narrative, the true spoken story, and scrambles all the words. So that it's all certainly English and all of the words are clearly words and all the words can be parsed by the brain as words, but it still doesn't make any sense. It is not English in that sense.
A liquid is only speak. Second, even for good reach the attack us. Living fact, which it was plants.
So normally I'll give an explanation that may be hitting a little close to home here. My explanation of what this sounds like is you've gone to a seminar in the wrong department. You understand what all the words are. You just don't understand it in that order. All right. So given those, we can do our multi-TRF analysis. We can generate, yeah.
Sorry, just curious, but same thing with this scrambled, no, not scrambled words. How do you call it? Yes,
Yeah,
scrambled
scrambled
word. It's not that easy to generate because it's not just random. It's following a sort of syntactic structure still. A liquid is only, so it's like noun, verb, and blah, blah. So how do you do that?
In this case, you're imposing structure that may be present in this sample that's not their overall samples.
Okay.
The structure that we imposed was we put in punctuation so that the prosody would sound natural. And that was something that we did on purpose. By the way, all of these three are generated by Google text-to-speech. Because otherwise it's very hard to get human readers to generate these non-words and scrambled words to sound very natural, but Google doesn't care.
If a liquid is.
All right. So we do the TRF analysis. These are the TRFs from the acoustic predictors. On the right is the TRF for the acoustic envelope. This is what is sometimes mean when someone says just I generated the TRF. That's this. This is the TRF that is deconvolved from the low frequency envelope of the speech with the low frequency neural response. So again, this is MEG, so these are neural currents. They could point in any direction. But to allow comparisons, I put a plus sign and a minus sign, where if this was EEG, it would be a positive peak and be a negative peak. And they're similar but different for the acoustic envelope onsets, the acoustic envelope. The envelope onsets actually explain a lot more variance than the envelope does. If anyone here is doing reconstruction, consider reconstructing the envelope onset instead of the envelope, see what happens. In terms of now interpreting what these mean, there's a 60 millisecond initial response. This is sometimes called the P1 in EEG. It comes from primary areas, A1-like areas in human cortex. And then the second one is sometimes called the M1. This is from a later area, an associative area. Attention is important for that area. We're not doing attention in this experiment, so that's not here, but we take that knowledge from the literature in here. Now, more interesting from the more modern perspective is the response to phonemes. I still can't get rid of that because I've lost my cursor. All right. So phoneme onset, we just put that in there because we want to have something there that's a constant as sort of a baseline when we're doing phoneme processing. Phoneme surprisal, that's much more interesting, and cohort entropy, much more interesting. They have TRFs that don't look like each other. Not only do they not look like each other in general, but they also have very different profiles in terms of these different stimuli that we used. But it is clear now that we do have this categorical processing that we can see in the brain. The latencies in terms of where in the processing stages these are going are pretty interesting. The first one, which is positive, is at about 80 milliseconds. So that's pretty soon after the 60 milliseconds P1 we saw. So this is pretty low level processing. This is something, it's language based, so it's not there from when you're born, but it is so ingrained in your brain that it is essentially bottom up processing. If you want to think of this as a circuit model, there's a whole bunch of gates that have been set for English processing. Once you set those, this is bottom up processing. Then there's these later peaks, especially in the cohort entropy at around 300 milliseconds, 300, 400 milliseconds, that have a negative polarity. So it's a different kind of processing and it's at a different stage of processing. These are very reminiscent of N400 processing in language studies. An example of an N400 is something where the brain is, the human and their brain is processing something unexpected. So a classic example for that would be someone listening to or reading the sentence, "Before I go to this dentist, I always make sure to brush my hair." That generates a beautiful N400. It's perfectly valid. There's nothing wrong with it. It even makes sense. It's just not what you expected. And so the brain gives this beautiful 400 millisecond latency, negative going response to that. And there are now some beautiful models that show how that can be a result of predictive coding models. The predictive coding can explain that.
Can I ask a beginner question? When you say it's a negative response, what does that mean in terms of the neural activity? Negative means, but does it mean the more neurons are active, or what?
It's extremely difficult to say what it means, because it means that the current is going in the opposite direction than it would be if it was positive. But that current could mean it's the same direction, but there's more inhibition than there is excitation. It could mean it's in the place of the brain where there's a different fold. And so the cortex is just 180 degrees off in terms of its alignment. And so that's not something that most people try to answer. So maybe that's a little bit of phrenology. Yeah.
Along those lines, how do you reconstruct the plus and minuses from the MEG? You just infer from the literature, or?
Oh, no. So there we look at we pick a plane that best divides the variance in one vector direction from another, and then we project the current onto that plane. And if it's very strong, if it's perpendicular to that plane, then it's just a positive and the negative. If it's not quite perpendicular, we lose a little. But that's good enough to get positive versus negative. Yeah.
Can you remind again how these three plots are different from each other? Are they three like TRFs over the same activity?
Thank you. Yeah. So these are TRFs generated from the same person listening to the same stimulus, but with different stimulus representations, different predictors. And so the phoneme surprisal TRF represents the parts of the brain that are processing phoneme surprisal as distinct from processing the acoustics or something else, in fact, is distinct from processing cohort entropy. And so because it's a multivariable regression.
Like different features, handcrafted features.
I see.
Yeah.
Right.
Handcrafted, chosen. And actually that's a very good point, because TRFs are purely linear. The brain is very nonlinear. How do TRFs even help us at all? Well, if we choose features based on what we believe or what we've seen different parts of the brain to process, then we can include the nonlinearities, certain nonlinearities in the stimulus representations right away. And then if we do that well, if we're lucky, or we've done it enough times, then we can get linear models to work well in terms of explaining variance. And beyond explaining variance, once they've explained variance, then we really do get this information. I mean, the explaining variance is not where these peaks are. These are all just coefficients in a regressor that's a vector. And so we're now interpreting what that vector is in terms of positive and negative, or two different uses of the word vector here. What's plotted here could just be a vector, but these are also 3D vectors. So it's a 3D vector and then a 3D vector and a 3D vector as a time series. And so we're interpreting those beyond just that it explain variance. Let's go beyond phonemes. Phonemes are useful. They may or may not be interesting. They're probably not interesting to most of the people in this room. Phonemes are used as the building blocks of words. Words and groups of words are used to convey meaning. Meaning is really important for us. Meaning is really important for many animals. Animal vocalizations are often, maybe exclusively, used to convey meaning, depending on what you believe in meaning. And so here's an example from the same lab as before, from E.L. Cohen's lab. These are rhesus monkeys' vocalizations. On the left, we have the spectrogram of a vocalization that's called a grunt. And then the middle and the right, we have two other vocalizations that are called harmonic arch and warble. The grunt is used by monkeys to express to other monkeys that this food is fine, it's meh. The harmonic arch and the warble are used to convey the information, the semantic meaning to other monkeys that this is good food. But they're totally different acoustically. And since they're perceived by the monkey as having two different meanings, even though there's three different sounds, then we might hope to find a part of the brain where that is performed. And in this case, in ventral prefrontal cortex, they were able to find neurons that responded differentially according to whether it was high quality food or low quality food, irrespective of what the acoustics were. Now I want to come back to humans. Words often
How do we know that we don't miss a difference between these two? That is a subtle difference that makes a difference between high quality foods to the monkey that we simply don't know about.
This is a typical neuroscience experiment. We can't rule out everything. But this is a concise, simple explanation. And when they did studies that were similar, they found similar findings. So I would give this a highly plausible, if not highly probable, interpretation to this. But it could, I mean, this is only 3 stimuli, and it's not balanced 1 versus 2. So there are lots of ways that could be also.
Possibly somewhere else there might be a difference, but we didn't look at it.
But I think the bigger picture is it's likely that somewhere in the monkey brain, this processing is happening, that there is somewhere where it is processing the representation of high quality food that is to be conveyed to other monkeys nearby versus the perception that this low quality food and that should be. So maybe it's not this area, but this area could be it. Yeah.
So in human speech, there's the same sound, but it has a different meaning depending on the context.
Yeah.
So do you see that as well? Or
excellent segue. So
that's not coming from audibly.
We're going to look at statistical measures that come from human language that are also divorced from the acoustics. And we've already taken care of the phonemes. And we'll look at some of those in addition to the phoneme measures and acoustic measures that we've been doing before. So we're going to expand the size of the MTRF. And now we're going to use new predictors, new representations based on language that are even more divorced from the acoustics, but that are also very interesting for us studying language processing in humans. And we've now reached the stage where you can view vocalizations as a carrier for semantic meaning or other things in monkeys at least, but certainly in humans, you can view the speech as a carrier for the linguistic information. And the brain is processing both. The brain is processing everything. It's a big place. There's lots of room for different things being processing. And if we're clever, we can come up with different representations that probe different parts of the brain doing the different kinds of processing. So word onsets is an interesting one because word onsets, it turns out, are not so easy to pick out. If you've ever looked at an acoustic version, the acoustic waveform of speech or even the spectrogram, figuring out where the words begin and end is extremely difficult. And as you do it more and more, you get a little better, but not a lot better. And that's because it's an intrinsically hard problem. So here we have the sentence which you are hearing live, the catalog in a library. But if you look at how this could be processed in real time and understood in different ways, there's a bunch of different ways where the word boundaries could be as opposed to where they actually are. And so one might guess that word onsets, the boundaries between words, may be partially a bottom-up automatic process using predictive coding, but there's probably also a secondary stage where extra information is used to correct the first version, which is not always going to be correct. We can also use, like we had phoneme surprisal, word surprisal. We use two different kinds. One is just purely word frequency-based surprisal. It's how often the words appear in this large database, and then one over that, take the log. That's the non-contextual word surprisal. The is very, very not surprising. More interesting is contextual word surprisal. So for this, we looked at n-grams and different models. The one that worked best for us was GPT-2. And this is, so if you've heard the words, if you happen to find, then you can ask how surprising is it in English, according to GPT-2, that the next word should be yourself, not surprising at all. If you happen to find not surprising either, but a little more surprising than yourself, etc. So we can generate probabilities for all of these. And we can look at the TRFs for these as well. For word onset, we again have this very pronounced positive peak. It's actually at about 100 milliseconds. I think I neglected to mention that the phoneme-based ones were, no, I think I said 80 milliseconds, yeah. So these are a little bit after phoneme, but still pretty darn early for the fact that these have been analyzed as word onsets and not just phoneme onsets. And then there is also this later 400 millisecond latency negative peak that looks a lot like an N400 and now has this nice interpretation that the first one is bottom up, primarily predictive coding, not using what you've experienced over a lifetime, but not in detail. But the second one is much more detailed. It's able to, this is the brain supplying extra information to say, no, that wasn't a word boundary. After all, this is the word boundary. Similarly with surprising. Yeah.
Why do you think there's no like strong sort of response to the onset, strong gradient response to the onset of non-words, just people finding it hard to segment the non-words?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. Non-words don't have word onsets except that we impose them on them. When you're listening to it live, where we break up the syllables and call them words is entirely up to us, with an asterisk that it's actually not entirely up to us. It's also how the Google text-to-speech synthesizer is interpreting them and how it subtly puts in extra pauses or not. And so there is some information about word boundaries, but it's not very reliable. And in fact, you can see in the word onset, there's this extra positive peak about 250 milliseconds, which to me indicates that there's a whole bunch of, the brain is processing the word alignment differently than the words, the non-words that we put on into the stimulus.
I mean, to interpret that is because the on the left, on the non-word, this first peak plus is because it's so confusing to us to hear that.
I think it's actually, it's a double peak because there is a peak at, it's just smaller.
The one at 250 or something.
Sorry, no, the one at about 100. There's a small green peak at 100 in word onset. And I think really it's just that the brain is misaligned. And so it's coming up with what it knows is a word onset as best it can tell, but it's not aligned with what we coded as the word onset. And those misalignments are on average about 200 milliseconds.
This is one of those TRFs where the feature is the words. Is this what you're showing?
This is the feature is the word. And again, when the feature is the word, but it's not a word, that's a little messy.
Okay,
Whereas the scrambled words, that's not a problem. The scrambled words and the plain narrative, those align pretty well. The surprisal, without context, we don't have a non-word because all non-words are equally surprising. It's the same thing as word onset. And then the contextual word surprisal, we don't have contextual word surprisal when we have scrambled words because the context is completely misleading. But we can compare it in the narrative case, and the contextual word surprisal looks a lot like the word surprisal, except it's actually bigger and explains more variance, which makes more sense from a human speech listening perspective. It's not, we don't care so much about how rare a word is in English. We care much more about how rare a word is in the context of what we've been listening to. But other than that, they're pretty similar, and so they're probably different aspects of the same mechanism.
Do you only ever look over that time period? What about like a longer time period? For example, when you don't understand what someone says and you go, oh, sorry, what?
Yeah.
And then you proceed to answer the question because your brain just very delayed.
Absolutely. So yeah, so it's a very common perspective that you hear what someone says, and then you go, oh, no, that's not what they said. And then you hear what they said as they actually intended to say it. You hear it differently, but that's usually not time locked. And so that's hard for us to see. That's going to be a lot of variation.
can't get reps of it. You can't get many reps of the same thing, right?
Well, but you'll get many reps, but with different latencies. And so they'll average away. So we have gone out to 1,000 milliseconds, and this is 600 is where we don't see anything. So just to summarize this part, and I'll have one more part after this, we do get these cortical responses that are time locking to emergent features. It's not just the acoustics. It's these features that are language based, that are certainly intended to be there by the speaker, but also we process them as though they were language because they are. We are looking for phonemes to make up the words, words to make up the meanings. These are categorical. That's just interesting in and of itself. If one is looking for things in the brain, categorical is a certain kind of robustness to it. And so that may be easier to find if you're looking for something categorical. Contextual word surprisal is not the same thing as semantic. So I'm not going to say we're doing semantic processing here or seeing semantic processing here. Certainly for large language models, I mean, saying, word surprisal is not, the large language models don't know what the words mean. I think most people would say that, but they do know a lot about where they're supposed to be. In the brain, in humans, they're very correlated. So if we're seeing something that is processing of word surprisal, it's probably also a whole bunch of semantic processing going on, but this experiment is not designed to tease that apart at all. So we're probably seeing some semantic processing, but we're certainly at least seeing word surprisal. And in general, we're seeing these different kinds of processing stages. We're seeing these bottom-up or primarily bottom-up, very early processing, and then we're seeing these much later repair, in some sense, processing that allows us to function even when predictive processing isn't working. And then, do I have 5 minutes more? We started late.
Yeah, go ahead.
5 minutes, yeah.
Okay. So this is a nice application. It's an audiology application, I suppose. It's about the intelligibility of speech. Speech can be intelligible or non-intelligible. Can we tell when it's intelligible or not? And the experimental design here is we use speech that is unintelligible. It's vocoded to make sure that it is non or very close to non-intelligible. Here's an example. Okay, did anyone understand what that was as speech? Good, okay. This is the speech that it was derived from.
Slice an apple through at its equator and you will find 5 small chambers arrayed in a perfectly symmetrical starburst, a pentagram.
Okay. Now I'm going to play the same acoustics as the first time. And listen to it and just see what you hear. So if English is your native language, you stood a better chance of saying that was intelligible than not. And I'm not going to say it's extremely intelligible, but most people for whom English is a native language can pick out many words. And even if they don't know what the word is, in terms of meaning, they can get a good example that it is a word. You can hear, for instance, word boundaries that are not present in the acoustics. And so the idea of this experiment is to look for neural responses to word boundaries that may be present in the second exposure, but are certainly not present in the first because there's no word boundaries there. And so if we just look at the behavior, everyone agrees that the clarity of the speech goes up from the first presentation to the second. And we look at the TRFs. I'm going to focus on the word onset TRF. This is just one subject, but everyone has a strong early response that's positive, a strong late response that's negative. And if we look at over subjects, going from blue to red, there's a significant increase in the word onset peak height. So the ability of the brain to process word onsets between pre and post, but it's small. It's 1 star for whatever that's worth. And both of those are small compared to the peach colored bar, which is word onset in the clean speech. And this is only in the left hemisphere. It makes sense for language processing. But the late response almost doubles between the blue and the magenta, between the early and the late. So this indicates that this later stage of pre-processing, using extra information that has been obtained from the priming, from listening to clean speech, is giving a dramatically stronger ability to process at that stage. And in fact, it's almost as high as it is for the clean speech. Acoustic responses do not show this at all. This is only in word-based responses. Word surprisal also shows this, but it's easier to show during a talk, the word. And so this is, I like to think of this as a potential for an objective measure of intelligibility. If this is something, nice source. Nice rescue. Okay, so this is my summary slide. We've been investigating neural speech and language processing in humans. There's clearly clinical applications like the last one. I like to think for this crowd, there might be some neuromorphic engineering applications in distinguishing how the brain is processing speech in different contexts. Also, just going back to the title in the beginning, I think these kinds of questions and these phrasing can allow us to go back and ask questions about the evolution of language. Because it says that we can ask questions that are like language questions in animals that don't have language because our brain is based on their brains and they have similar processing like categorical processing that we have even without language. And on that, I'll just say thank you. And this, I think, is from 1998. This was taken by Pamela Abshire of me when I was a postdoc here. No, not my first idea.
My slide, everything got haywire. Do you like that one? Okay, so I'm going to talk about neuromorphic audio edge AI. Look, Toby, I have the pointer on. Anyway, I mean, usually those neuromorphic and AI don't quite go together, and some people don't like them to go together either. But I'm going to show you how they could go together. And so I start then with a little bit of what I presented last year at Telluride, and it was about hearing with silicon cochlear. So you can see my past, which was really more along the neuromorphic style of doing things. And so basically it starts off with the history of neuromorphic hearing. And so as you know, from the anatomy, the sounds coming in goes to the eardrum and then causes the vibrations of the bones in the middle ear, hits the cochlea.
Can you just get rid of that dumb okay at the top there? I think that's you.
I don't see it on my slide. So
Is it on this computer? Okay, yeah, thanks.
Okay.
No.
It's on here.
It's your computer.
But where is it? I don't see it. Oh, this, you hit something that wasn't there. Okay, my screen. Yeah, and so anyway, if you unroll the cochlea, then there's the basal membrane that sits in the middle, and this membrane is shaped in a way so you can pick up different frequencies from different places along the membrane. And so if you look at basically these responses, then they basically look like a set of bandpass filters. And of course, there is the fluid that the membrane sits in. And so you can actually make a hydrodynamic model of the actual cochlea. And this is what Dick Lyon and Carver Mead did back in 1988. And they built an analog electronic cochlea with more than 200 channels. And so this was really the start of how the silicon cochlea designs came around. And of course, if you look at the back to the anatomy, you can see that it's not just a piece of membrane, but actually this membrane is actually a partition where the basal membrane sits at the bottom, and then you have two sets or two types of hair cells, the inner hair cells and the outer hair cells. And then you can see these partitions that go across the membrane. And also there's another membrane that sticks on top. This is a tutorial membrane, and I won't go into detail about this. But really, so the cochlea is actually quite a complex structure. And of course, what goes out of the cochlea is a set of spikes, and this is carried by the what we call the spiral ganglion cells. And so over the years, since the very first cochlea in 1988, there have been many people who worked on circuits to emulate the functionality of what you see in the cochlea. And this includes a set of students from Carver, Rahul Sapeshkar, Lloyd Watts, which some of you know, Andrew van Schaik, who did his PhD with Eric Vitos in Switzerland, also Corbena Boan, and also later his student Bowen, who built a lovely design that also includes the local gain control of the outer hair cells. So really, there's a rich history of all the silicon designs that have been done in this area. And so I got into, okay, so nowadays, basically the silicon cochlea, the spiking silicon cochlea consists of a set of channels here. And in each channel, you would have a low-pass filter or band-pass filter, followed by a halfway rectifier, which is a model of the inner hair cell. And then you have an integrated fire neuron that then generates the spikes out of each of the channels. And you set the central frequency of the filters in each of these channels, so you can span, say, between 10 hertz to, say, 5 kilohertz, if you want to match how the biological cochlea works. And so in around 2014 or so, actually even before that, Andre van Schaik and I had got together and built the spiking silicon cochlea, and with the help of Toby, who built this lovely infrastructure for the DBS. So we built what we call the dynamic audio sensor, which is a binaural cochlea with 64 frequency channels, and the spikes are sent out using the address event representation protocol. And so if to give you an idea of what it looks like, so here are the set of channels spanning from 8 hertz to 20 kilohertz. I'm going to play a chirp, and then you should see a set of spikes showing up. They're going to be different colors for the 2 ears. Okay, I can't play it.
Just put space, maybe.
Let me try.
Animate.
No. Yeah. Okay, so you can hear the sound. Yeah, here it comes. Now it sounds softer than usual. Okay, but you see, as the frequency goes up, then the channels corresponding to the high frequencies, then I have no idea where the
It's the board. It's the board.
It looks like a board.
how do I do? Delete?
Not the board, but it's kind of.
Oh, it's gone. Okay. And so we did a number of interesting things with the spikes, because here it's about the spikes, right? And so one thing that was really lovely is that you could do binaural localization using spike timing. And so this is using intraoral time differences of the spikes between the left and the right ear. And so you can take the spikes from a channel of each ear, look at the delta T between them, and then you can tell where the sound source is by looking at this delta T, right? If I look at the distribution of delta T's from all the spikes coming from the channels of the 2 ears, then I can build this ITD histogram, intraoral time difference histogram. And so it basically tells you where the sound source is in space. And okay, I can't play this. Let me see. you can combine it also with the DBS, so you can look at the sort of the correlation between the spikes from the DBS and the cochlea. I had to.
Here we see the spikes from the cochlea and a localization result showing the peak where the sound is located.
Yeah. So basically, when you move, then you can see this peak moves, right? So also it's real time, so you can see that the changes happen as soon as he moves. But of course, he has the voice also, so that you can get the spikes from the cochlea. So at the time, also we also tried to do real-time speaker identification. So now this is a classification problem, and of course, deep learning had come around at the time, and so we use something called the support vector machine. So first, we extracted features from the cochlea spikes using, say, the average interspike interval distribution, also the spike density in each of the channels.
The mouse disappeared here, Shih-Chii. The pointer.
Yes. And then you can classify them through a linear support vector machine using, and in this case, we use a data set came from Primate. And you can get more than 90% accuracy using these features from the spikes, right? So it sounds kind of cool that actually the spiking output representation really could carry this information so that you can do such high accurate classification. And so now I just play quickly. So yes.
Explain what's going on here.
So what you're going to see is, so now here we play sensors, right, one after each other. Yeah, and then you have to identify who the speaker is, right? And so the correct speaker is the one that's shown with this red bar here. Yeah, and then you see the probability of who that speaker is by this blue bar.
Will you please confirm government policy regarding waste removal?
The meeting is now adjourned.
The dark, murky lagoon wound around 4 miles.
An adult male baboon's teeth are not suitable for eating shellfish.
I'll have a scoop of that exotic purple and turquoise sherbet.
The frightened child was gently subdued by his big brother.
The speech symposium might begin Monday.
Okay, I'm going to stop it for a second. So along the x-axis are the speakers, right? And so every time a new sentence comes, then you see this red bar that moves, right? And the red bar says, look, this is the correct speaker. And so what you can see is if it's correct, then at some point the blue should move into the red, right? And so most of the times this happens, and you can also see that it takes time for it to go there, right? So which is what you expect, because you need to transition into the next speaker. Yeah. So anyway, so this is just a summary of what I presented last time. And so now I'm going to switch my head because, time goes by, deep learning became very beneficial to us, right? Because you can now train networks to solve this kind of problems, classification problems. And so this is the outline of my talk. It's going to go into 3 categories. So first, I'm going to describe the specifications of what I call now audio edge AI. And then I'm going to talk about neuromorphic principles that we embed in audio edge AI. And finally, I'm going to demonstrate a sub-10 microwatt end-to-end spoken language understanding edge SoC, which I brought along here so that you can also try it out later. Possibly the sentences that you need to say for the chip to recognize what you're saying. Okay, like turn up the temperature in the kitchen, which is always useful when you need to cook, maybe. Okay, so let's first go to the current edge AI situation where you have a lot of devices and all of us are now using voice commands, right? Speech has become very important. And so this is actually a very, I think a good topic to work on because it's going to be useful for many devices. And so when I talk about edge AI, what I mean is don't send it to the cloud, right? So everything,
use the mouse.
Everything runs on the device itself. And so then you don't have to worry about Wi-Fi and all kinds of stuff, privacy and so on. And so, but you still need to keep certain things for the network that has to solve this, or the network that has to do this edge AI task. And so one of them is that it still needs to be accurate. It needs to still run in real time. Of course, everything has to run on the device itself, and it needs to be low power, right? And so you could say, what is low power, right? You can throw out this qualitative stuff. And so if you have an understanding of the kind of power that you need for your device in solving a task, what you can get away with. So here's a plot. Boy, it's tough. Here's a plot of power versus the battery life of a 20 milliamp power, 20 milliamp hour battery that has a capacity of this battery. And so if you have a chip that burns, say, a milliwatt, you can see it lasts less than a day. And if you want it to run for a whole year, then your chip has to burn 10 microwatts. Okay, so it gives you a sense of the scale of the power of your device when you're building them. And so if I now transition to, well, for audio, what kind of tasks are we interested in? What's the cheapest thing that we can do if we're now limited to this kind of small power scales? Okay, the two tasks that a lot of people in the circuits community work on, not just in the neuromorphic world, but also in the circuits world, is voice activity detection. So if you have the sentence turn up the temperature of the kitchen, then it detects where the speech is in the waveform. And the other one is keyword spotting, which is the next more complex task, right? And so in this case, if the keyword is kitchen, then basically then you spot the kitchen in the word kitchen in the waveform. Okay, so all cool. All right. And so how do we build these chips? Yeah.
For keyword spotting, do you just care yes or no this keyword was found, or do you want to know where it was found in time? Also? Yeah,
so I think in this case, you detect when the keyword is spoken.
So just yes, no.
Yeah, so like a yes, no, yes. And the data set that a lot of people use is the Google speech command data set, which has 10 keywords, silence, and background. Yeah, so you'll see that this data set is used a lot in the community where people build circuits.
Like when to find time?
Oh, it's like I spotted this keyword and it appeared at this point in the waveform.
It's more like when somebody says the word keyword, right? You're talking.
Yeah, it's like, so I saw hey Google, but did you say hey Google or Google?
Yeah.
In one case you'll be able to tell, the other case you couldn't.
That's
the order of it.
For example.
That it should do, right? I mean, hey Google should be different than Google Hey.
Yeah, it will be different. Yeah, if you train the network to do this.
But then the keyword is defined to be hey.
Yes,
Right.
yes. It's whatever the keyword you chose. It could be 2 words, 1 word, and so on. And so when we build these chips or these devices, usually it will consist of course, the microphone, which then feeds, which gives you the waveform, and then it goes to a feature extractor, and then to a neural network that's trained on one of these tasks, right? So in this case, it's voice activity detection or keyword spotting. And so there's a bunch of different designs that have been built, and I found a paper where they collected kind of the designs that were done until about 2022. And so you can see on this trend plot here, right, they plotted power versus latency, right? And here you can see the different designs that have been done. They're done in different technologies, 180 nanometer, 90 nanometer, sometimes on FPGA. Sometimes using analog circuits, sometimes mixed signal circuits, or sometimes totally digital circuits. So again, like a zoology of designs that have been done. But what's clear from this trend over here is that if you want low latency, so basically you want the system to respond very quickly, right? Then you need to put in more power, okay? So that's always like a trade-off between all these things that we would love to have, real time, low power, etc. Okay. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the neuromorphic principles that we have embedded in the circuits we've been building for audio edge AI. And I go back again to these building blocks, again, feature extractor neural network. And when you do any one of these tasks, so you would have the waveform, the feature extractor gives you a feature map. I mean, you can do like a spectrogram, and then you can then look at the power and the frequency as a function of time. And then you could train the neural network to do some particular task, right? That then gives you the score for different words, for example. Now, the way that conventionally what people do and still do is that you would sample the waveform, right? And so in this case, the feature extractor consists of a set of blocks here. So this is a low noise amplifier. followed immediately by an analog digital converter. So basically you take the analog signal and then you basically convert into a digital signal. And then you send it to a DSP, right? That's the fast Fourier transform that you need to get your spectrogram. And one thing is that if you look at these designs and you look at the amount of system power that this block takes up compared to the total system power, it takes it takes a big percentage. So in this design, I think which came from Geraldo, basically the feature extractor, which is really coming from the ADC itself, right? It takes 50% of the system power. So you want to be able to remove or to remove the ADC completely so that you can reduce the system power of your device. And so there have been a few designs reported also by an ex-student in our group. And this is inspired by the silicon cochlea. And again, you recognize kind of the blocks that I've talked about for the silicon cochlea. So again, the waveform comes in, goes through a low noise amplifier, then goes to a set of channels, and each of the channels have a bandpass filter, a rectifier, and then an encoder that generates the spikes. Yeah. And these designs have reported power that's less than 0.5 microwatts. And in the previous design that I talked about, where you use the conventional way of designing, that front end could burn around 7 microwatts, right? So it's a lot lower power. And in this particular ASIC that uses this front end cochlea design, they built a 1 microwatt voice activity detection chip. The whole chip burns 1 microwatt, which is really amazing. Okay. So you can see that this kind of neuromorphic ideas are also coming into these designs for audio edge AI. And what about the network types, right? So here now we move on to the next building block, which is a network. And if you look at the designs that have been done, well, there's CNNs, RNNs, feedforward. People have used all these different types of designs, depending on which one you have more experience in or you like to use. We ourselves, we prefer RNNs because they're closest to SNNs, right? Because they have state. And for the people who don't do design, this is just to give you a feeling why we worry about power and how we look for ways to save power, right? So if I take a network and I have to compute the network, so for example, I want to compute what Y is from X, then basically Y equals to W times X, the weight times the input vector. And so here's your X, your input vector, your weight matrix, and then you do the multiplication and you can get now the next vector, the activations for the next layer, which is Y. And when you do this on an ASIC, you have something that looks like this. Yeah, you're gonna have a block, so I'm gonna simplify everything. So we have a processing element block that does the multiplication. Then you have 2 ways that you can have memory, because memory is actually the thing that's very important when you do this kind of calculations. So we have SRAM, which stays on chip. Yeah. And then we also have DRAM, which is a lot cheaper, but you can store many more things. And so that's off chip. And from some measurements that were done by Horowitz back already 10 years ago, what's clear is that the power that you get, the power that you burn from just doing the operations, right, the multiplication, if you say this is 1x, then the equivalent power for fetching the information across from SRAM or from DRAM is a lot higher, right? So for example, if I need to fetch, say, the weights from SRAM, then it's going to be 10x higher than doing the operations. If I fetch it from DRAM, it's going to be 1,000x higher. And so for these designs that people report, usually what you do is you try to keep everything on chip, right? Don't try to go off chip, which means that you can only have small networks, right? Because you couldn't store all the weights of a larger network or even at activations. And so what's clear is that the energy consumption of the chip is going to depend on the number of operations that you're going to do. So a bigger network is going to lead to more operations, and also the number of fetches from memory. And if you need to fetch from off-chip memory, well, it's more costly than fetches from on-chip memory. So again, everything is kept on chip if you want to show a very highly energy efficient edge audio ASIC. So there are also different ways that people have been working on over the years try and get this energy efficiency. So for example, I might want to have a larger network because it gives me higher accuracy. Well, the methods that have been around now for several years, where they call algorithms that really try to sparsify your network connections. And this is what we call static sparsity. It's a form of model compression. There are different ways of doing it. So that's one called pruning. So you take a fully connected network like this, and you prune away the connections that are not needed during training. The other way is that you quantize all your parameters so that then you use less memory. So you go from the 32-bit float down to binary if possible. The other thing is because the things we do is always co-design between the algorithm and also the hardware, you can come up with architectures like a CNN architecture where you do depthwise convolution, which saves also on memory. Now, all these methods here are independent of the input. It doesn't matter what input's doing, right? Yeah, I mean, basically, once you've trained the network for the sparsity, then you just deploy it on your system. But today, I want to talk about another kind of sparsity that we can also bring into these networks. They're not spiking, by the way. And this is the sparsity that's inspired by our brain. You know, it's about spikes, of course, right? And also the fact that if you have to look at recordings of neurons, so this is an experiment that one of Toby's students and also Fritjof Hamken, who does a lot with custom imaging. So if you image like a set of cells, then you can see, right, there are 4 neurons here that are active. And then here is a DBS output, an event camera output. And you can see this little red box here. You see there was a flash all of a sudden. Yeah. And most of the time, everything is just kind of about the same, right? It shows you that activity in general in the brain is sparse, right? The DBS was there because they wanted to see if they could catch this, once in a while, poof, easily. Okay, and then there's also a couple of papers that try to estimate what the spike rate of the brain is, which is like 1 hertz, and also the inputs go from 1 to 10 kilohertz, depending on where you are. So it's saying that you get away with also very kind of high dynamic sparsity. We call this dynamic sparsity because it changes, right? Whichever neurons are active at any one time, any moment in time is going to be different. And so what I'm going to talk about next is how we're trying to bring dynamic sparsity to ANNs, to CNNs, RNNs, or feed-forward networks. And in fact, it's already going on because in the normal ANN activation functions, people use ReLUs. So here is an example where you have one of the feature maps from a convolutional layer, right? And then you convolve it with this kernel. And then once you pass it to this activation function, this rectified linear unit activation function, my laser is missing. Here we go. Yeah, you can see that you force many things to be 0, right? As soon as they're negative, they're 0. And so you get a lot of zeros in the output feature map, right? If you subsample, then it goes down smaller, but that's not the point here. So the point here is that you can actually save a lot if you build now custom hardware that skips over the 0, because you don't have to compute zeros, right? 0 times anything is 0. So here again is the X, the input vector times the weight matrix. I've got a couple of zeros here. What I can do is just drop all the weight columns here so that now I have a much smaller multiplication of the weight times the input vector. Okay. Now, but how about RNNs, right? So RNNs, unfortunately, don't use ReLUs. I mean, you could use ReLUs, but usually people find that RNNs with ReLUs don't work so well. So this is a kind of a complicated picture of the LSTM. Some of you know this, but you can see different gates that have different activation functions. Usually they use sigmoids and tanh, right? And so they're not going to be sparse, right? Unnecessarily sparse. And so when people do comparisons of SNN to RNNs, I mean, SNNs always win because RNNs are just naturally dense, right? So here the activations are considered dense because the activations are signal tanh. But what I want to show next is that you can actually also introduce dynamic sparsity, in this case, temporal sparsity, by using delta activations, okay? And so we call this the delta recurrent network or delta network. And to show you how it works, so we're going to have neurons that can be activated or inactivated. And the way of judging whether it's one or the other is that you look at the activations across 2 time steps. And so just assume at 1 time step, this neuron has this level of activation. At a 2nd time step, the activation change past a threshold that you set, right, on top of the previous activation. So if it exceeds that, then it's considered to be active. It's a bit like the neuron produces a spike. And for this neuron over here, because the activation change is much smaller, then it's below the threshold. And so then we say this neuron is inactivated, or it didn't produce a spike, if you like. And so now here's the picture of what happens when you have a set of 4 neurons that have a level of activation shown here. And it's driving another set of 3 at the top. So in the next time step, we look and see how much the activation has changed. Yeah. And then now we say, okay, which one's activated, which one's not, by now putting on this threshold condition. And of course, it's this guy who won. Let me see if I can do. Yeah. And so now what you have to do is to just fetch for memory the weights associated with this neuron and update all the other neurons. So basically, with this kind of temporal sparsity, you can reduce the memory access and also the computes in the network, and also increase the speed up and also the energy savings in the hardware. Okay. And so Chen Gao was one of our ex-PhD students, was here a couple of years ago. So he had been building a set of this delta RNN hardware platforms for the last few years since he was a PhD. And so I want to show you just 2 of them here. So one is actually now we've done an ASIC. We call it the delta keyword spotting. So basically it has the delta GRU as the post-processing network. And then the other one is this platform called Spartus. It's done on FPGA, has the delta LSTM model. And he looked at the accuracy, which is the phoneme error rate on timid and Libri speech. And this particular platform or design combines both the static weight sparsity and the temporal sparsity together. And to give you an idea of what you can get with these designs is, so here's the keyword spotting accuracy on the Google Speech Command dataset. And we're going to vary the delta threshold, right? We know that if we vary the delta threshold, you're going to save in energy at some point. Yeah. So if you look at the keyword spotting accuracy, if I swing my delta threshold past 0.2, then the accuracy starts dropping. But at the same time, if I look at the energy per decision, you can see it starts dropping much faster as the threshold increases. Right? In this case, if I pick this as the design point, that gives me a 3.4x savings in the energy per decision. I can also look at the sparsity and also the latency. So again, as I increase the delta threshold, the sparsity increases, the temporal sparsity increases. And then also equivalently, the latency also decreases, right? So you actually save by, more than 2x here. And with Spartus, so this is now combining both types of sparsity. It's a kind of a tricky plot to read, but I'm just gonna kind of give you the summary points. So again, varying the delta threshold, looking at the effective throughput. If I have a static sparsity, I can increase it by 3x. And then if I do, oh, sorry, how many x is that? 14x, sorry. And then if I have temporal sparsity, so again, now doing the delta, then I can get another 3x, gives me a 46x total gain in the effective throughput, right? So all these sparsity methods seem to have helped a lot in reducing the compute and latency of the system. And so now this is our latest. This is the spoken language understanding ASIC. I'm going to speak more about this design. Oh, I still have time. Good. So I wanted to highlight just the 3 people who I think were key in getting this design, this beautiful design working. So Sheng Zhu, who was the kind of the designer for the analog part of the chip, and Jiqiao Li for the digital part of the chip. So that's our network. So basically we have an analog mixed signal front end and a digital back end. Yeah. And also Longyao Cheng was a postdoc in a group, and and is doing a lot of research on audio algorithms. And so it was great to have the three together. And so I'm going to first show a demo of this chip working. This is cut by Toby. So if you don't like it, Toby, have. Okay, so you can see this board, which I've also brought, very small board. This is the keys, so you can compare the scale of the board. There's a little display over here, and this display gives you, shows you the network output, which is going to be in the form of icons. Unfortunately, I put the slide for this at the back. Okay, anyway, you'll get the idea. So basically, all right, I think I'm gonna, let me go skip to the part that shows, I should have put this one earlier. Okay, so this network was trained on the Fluent Speech Command data set. It was a data set that came from Yosha Bender's group. And there are a bunch of sentences spoken by different people. And the sentences are set up so that you lead to some intent that is in three different classes: action, object, and location.
Mouse, better. Mouse pointer. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so you could say something like, make it louder, right? And what the network will put out, if it's trained properly, is that action is to increase, object is the volume, and location is none, right? On on this little PCB, there's a display, and all it shows you is this, okay? So it's clear what the output was of the network. You could say switch the bedroom's lights on, so action deactivate, object lights, location bedroom, icon is light bulb, bed. Change system language, you get this. Okay, you could say change the system language to German, and then you get a DE, Deutsch, added to the icon. Yeah, and the object would be German. And then turn on the bathroom lights. Yeah, it's again light bulb, and the sink. Turn on the key in the kitchen would be a thermometer and a stove. Yeah, so very kind of simple icons. All right. So in the demo,
On the count of three, start recording. 1, 2, 3. And
turn sun down.
Turn off the lights. Play music.
Set language to Korean.
Fetch the newspaper.
Increase the heating.
bring socks.
Could you increase the heating?
That's too loud.
Decrease the volume.
Okay, so there we also wanted to show, which you'll see in a second, is that we also include global and local gain control in the channel. So I wanted to show that even if you're sitting further away, you could also say the sentence, and the network would still put out the intent. So here we go. So we have the Fluent Speech Command data set. It's continuous speech. It's got the feature extractor, mixed signal feature extractor with the network, the digital design, and then putting out the intent in 3 classes: action, object, location. And it's end-to-end trained. SLU stands for spoken language understanding. Continuous speech input, user intent output. The acoustic feature extractor is the 4th order bandpass filter with a Q of 4. Also has local gain control. The backend is the gated recurrent unit. 2 layers of 64 delta neurons and 1 fully connected layer to the 32 classes. There are 32 classes, by the way, from this data set. And yeah, you always boast about your accuracy. Okay, more than 90% accuracy. And well, this one for me is more important, which is that you can get more than 85% accuracy over 75 dB dynamic, 75 dB input range. Okay. And so I wanted to also give you a picture of what the overall architecture looks like of just the front end. So again, a single-ended mic coming into a low noise amplifier, going now to a set of bandpass filters that have different central frequencies. Going to a programmable gain amplifier, PGA. And then there's an amplitude extractor that measures the power in the channel. And then this is then used by the channel AGC block that goes back and changes the gain of the amplifier for each channel. And we also have a global AGC that goes back and changes the gain of the low noise amplifier. So we're using both types of AGC. And then we take the output of the different channels, we normalize it, and this is what we feed now into the delta recurrent network. So it's an accelerator that has this set of blocks. So that's a processing element array, like what I showed in the previous slide. There's a finite state machine that controls how the data is fed into this PE array. We also do pooling. You'll see in a second, we do temporal pooling across the layers. And we also have a delta encoder that does the comparison of the pre and the post activations. And then we also have this 48 kilobyte of word memory to store all the weights, etc. And what's read out is the per class probabilities. And some measurement results. So if you look at the accelerator power over time, where you have speech within noise, here it's showing how much the power changes when you change the delta threshold. Yeah, so you can see when the speech comes, then there's a increase in the power, and then when the speech goes off, then there's a drop in the power. If I change the delta threshold from 0 to 0.125, then as we would like to see is that the power drops by increasing the threshold. Yeah, over here. And you can also look at how much the accuracy changes, right, with the delta threshold. So in this case, since it starts dropping past 0.125, we kept this as the design point. And then similar like the other plots, you can look at sparsity and also the power as a function of delta threshold. So at this design point, it was a little bit less than 7 microwatts. Okay. This is only actually for the accelerator, not the front. And again, it's a 2-layered recurrent network. So basically, this was sort of to try and show that only for each input vector that comes in, only a subset of the neurons are active, right? So these are the ones that are colored in solid, right? It goes to the first layer, and then the second layer, we actually pull the output of 2 time steps, in this case, what's shown here, before we update the next, before we let the next layer GRU update. I'm not explaining this properly, but it's temporal pooling. Okay, so basically you don't update on every time step for the second layer, you update every other time step, right? So then you can save computes. And so now if you look at the max, the multiply accumulate operations as a function of the frame, of each frame, then for the baseline, you would do 20K max. If you add temporal pooling, so you're gonna now skip some max, then you can drop it down by 2x. And then if you do the delta encoder, then you can drop it by 4x. And similarly, you see kind of this drop for the power, and the power drops by 2.3x by using a delta network. And this shows you the layout. So this is the board again. The chip sits here. You can see the layout of the chip. It's got the analog front end here, and then it's got the digital backend down at the bottom, right? And for the 8.6 microwatts that I spoke about, you can see the feature extractor burns 21% of it. And the rest of it, most of it comes from the accelerator, okay, 78%. And this is similar to what I mentioned before for the specs for the chip, is that if I look across the input amplitude, this is measuring the input range, dynamic range. And I look at the accuracy. If I don't have this local gain control, right, then you get this gray curve over here. And if I pick 85% as the number that I want to set the dynamic range, then I only get 34 dB. But if I have the AGC, then this is the orange curve, yeah? And you can see that you can get a much bigger input range by having AGC. And when you send your design to, or when you send its results or your paper to this particular conference, ISSCC, where they're very interested in specs of your design, right? So usually your paper is only 2 pages, and 1 page is text, 1 page is figures. That's all. And your title better tell the person what your specs are, right? That's the name of the game. So anyway, as I said, there are many groups that are building this edge audio ASICs, and so this just gives you a picture of it's kind of a sample of them. So usually you define the speech test. So a lot of people doing keyword spotting. So we basically kind of got bored and didn't want to chase after accuracy. So we moved to spoken language understanding. And so now the input type, instead of a single word, is now a whole sentence. What everybody cares about is the number of classes that you can get high accuracy, right, for the power, because in the end, people also care about power. So that also varies across the different designs. And you can see the algorithm that they use to get the accuracy also varies. As you see, it's GRU, LSTM, CNNs. This is SwitchCat CNN. And this is our work, it's a Delta GRU. A different process, people use different process because they use what they can get. Yeah. And then memory, of course, is important because the bigger the amount of memory you can afford on chip, the bigger the network you can support. But of course, that also comes with the cost of area, and area costs money. So the bigger the area, the more you have to pay for your chip, right? So there's always this trade-off that we think about. Of course, accuracy is important. People try to get above 90% on anything. So it sounds nice. And then for us, we now report also the dynamic range of our ASIC for this task. And power is also another important spec that people care about. So in our case, it was less than 10 microwatts, which, yeah, happy with this. Okay, you have to remember 10 microwatts, your PC burns about 10 watts. Okay, so it's to show you the scale of how low the power is. Okay, now one thing that you might wonder is that how do you get this high accuracies even with the non-idealities that you know of analog circuits, right? So it's to show with this block diagram, the front end, the feature extractor is still using mixed signal circuits, and the back end is digital circuits. Digital circuits usually work easier, right? When you get it back, when you get the chip back. And so one thing that we developed with the design of this chip, actually, this is what Sheng Zhu did, is that he came up with this flow for doing hardware-aware training. Yeah, so you're going to have this SoC over here that consists of your feature extractor and also the accelerator, right? That's going to put out your user intent. And so now you have to train the network on this accelerator so that you're going to get good accuracy. And one thing I forgot to say is that also the parameters, the weights and biases of this network is only 8 bits, right? So we also have to train the network so that the accuracy stays high, even though the parameters are quantized. And so, as you can imagine, if you've done circuit design, if you do any kind of analog circuit design, the simulation time takes forever, right? We usually use cadence, and it takes hours to do this. So what he did was he took you enter the schematic of your design, right? You run your simulation in Spectre, which is one of the programs from Cadence. And then you get some measurement, some idea of the offset noise and nonlinearity that you get with your design. And then you embed this into a behavior model, right, which runs much faster. And then you use this behavior model along with the network to do the training, right, so that you can then figure out what the weights should be so that when you download it down to the SoC, that it still works well. Okay, and to show you the difference in the amount of training time, so if I'm going to put my circuit in the pipeline for training the network, right, then it's going to take forever, right? So you can see here, if you do a transistor level simulation, it takes 51 hours, right? Just one input. But if you can do a behavior model, then it takes you 0.49 seconds. Okay, so it shows you the behavior model was very useful. And then you can also embed the statistics of the non-idealities you get with analog circuits. And this you can do because if you do analog circuits, you know, there's this non-idealities that come from device mismatch, from electronic noise. Also, if you have some large circuit signal behavior, that people who do algorithms don't have to worry about, but we worry about because we have limits on our power supply. Then you get this effects such as signal clipping and non-linearities that show up even though they shouldn't show up. Then being able to embed this into this hardware-aware training was very important, so that then I could, when the chip comes back, I can plug it in, load the weights, it works as I expected, and I can take another chip, plug it in, and it still works, right? So I think this was a very nice thing that came out also of the work. Yeah. So I want to then conclude. This is kind of nice and tight. Yes.
So I have a quick question. You said hardware aware training, but from maybe the arrow was missing in your picture, but it's not per chip weights, right? It's
it's a statistics
with the statistics.
Yeah, the statistics. Yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yes, you're right.
So the training happens on chip here, like how do the weights get?
No, off chip. Yeah, everything's done off chip. Yeah, and then you just load the weights. Yeah, right. Yeah.
Same weights independent of the chip. That's it.
Yeah.
In the training, it introduced all the mismatch variation.
That's a
every time you
pain.
play the sample, maybe or set of samples or epoch.
Yeah.
Have a different matching of the channels.
Because people always ask you this question, right? If you do analog circuits, you can get mismatch. How do you know? Yeah.
You quantize during the training or after?
No, during training also. Yeah, we do quantization, aware training, all that stuff that's needed.
Could you explain a little bit how do you do the behavioral modeling? How is it?
Yeah, in Python. In what sense?
It's almost dead. You see a message on the other screen. Oh no.
Oh no, installing. Okay, that we can speak after. So I have 10 minutes. Toby has one slide that I would like him to present. Because he's very proud of this slide. Okay. Okay. All right. So okay, anyway, I just want to conclude by saying that, the brain can inspire both sides, SNN and also ANNs, right? On the ANN side, by bringing in sparsity, of course, maybe more than that in the future. And for the neuromorphic side, actually, AI was very important for us because we could have new training methods for conferring the weights of the network so that, the network works well. And also there are also this very interesting sparsity models that have been appearing also in the algorithmic world that I think are also very useful for us to think about, what our brain might be doing, right? Given that it's amazingly highly energy efficient. And for us also, we've been staying a lot with RNNs because they're the most similar to SNNs, and I think it could give insights into how we can train sparse SNNs because, neuromorphic is not about using SNNs just as it is, right? Because if you have an SNN that's producing lots of spikes, it's not going to save you any power. Okay, you're going to burn even more power than an ANN. So really have to figure out or have the proper arguments to say, look, if you use an SNN, you're going to get this kind of benefit for energy efficiency, but not just using an SNN. Please don't ever say that. Okay, and the neuromorphic impact, I think, on audio edge AI is that, from the example I gave, is that you can bring dynamic sparsity to low power edge ANN computing. There also, I didn't talk about it, but there are also benefits that come with network training by having the sparse activity. And also, I think it's really nice to be able to show the benefits of these neuromorphic ideas. In our case, of course, it's by showing that our edge ASIC specs actually outperform the more conventional ways of design in terms of power, accuracy, and latency. But everything's not about that only, but I think this is one of the ways you can show your impact.
And area too, right?
And area, yeah. So for Outlook, I think it's, for me, other kinds of gating models that encourage dynamic sparsity is interesting. We had something called the FACE LSTM, also another group with Christian Meyer. Yeah, Christian Meyer. Sorry, thank him. So anyway, they also had a model called EGRU, which I think is still very interesting. And lastly, of course, there's the kind of sparsity that just comes for free, right? And so Toby here, yeah, this is from Toby's recording again. Upper mouse with the DVS, showing that you don't have to process every frame, right? If you measure the activity of what comes out behind camera across 35 hours, right? You see these periods where you have a lot of events. And all these times here where you don't have events, you don't have to process anything. So actually your savings come extra when you operate your system in the natural world. So pretty much that's what they save. And so we should really also think about whether we can take advantage of networks that understand sparsity in the natural environment and process on the bursts of events when the mouse moves in this case. And Toby actually did this recording. I put this up because Toby.
I'll explain
Yes.
it. Yeah, so what I was disappointed in the benefit you would get from temporal sparsity from this delta networks, right? I was really disappointed. We only got like 3x, 4x benefit, apparently. The reason is obvious in hindsight is because when you measure this, the benefit, you're doing it on a dense data set. You know, there's nothing but speed. And so I made a recording of myself over 2 different 24-hour periods on my cell phone. And then Sheng and I ran that through this delta network, and you see that the actual temporal sparsity is just like super high. You see the input feature sparsity is like 99.9% on the averaged over hours. This is hours of the day. And this is the sparsity level starting here at, I think, 96% sparsity. So if you look at the input feature sparsity, it's like 99.9%. If you look at the 2 hidden layers of this RNN, this rather small RNN, you see it's over 98% most of the time on this real recording, on the average over hours. It only drops down to maybe, I mean, basically super sparse. So you can get like massive speed ups by using this temporal sparsity compared with benchmarking it on a real data set, you know, on a typical training data set. That's the point. This is audio, just audio cell phone recording.
Yeah, actually, so yeah, they didn't know this before, but this is 0.97, so.
97%, yeah, that's the minimum sparsity. You get average over hours, you know, over seconds, of course, is much lower sparsity.
Yeah.
And this is like just me in Australia, I think. I was riding the train, I was sleeping, I was watching TV, I was talking to people in the office, riding my bike around, phone sitting in my pocket or on the desk. I think it's dramatic.
Yeah, so.
Versus just it's, you know, anecdotal.
Yeah. So yeah, you got a 20x savings with your calculation. Okay, and then the last thing, yes, the third point over here, I think this dynamic sparsity can be carried out further in more intelligent networks. Yeah, and that's the next thing to go for. And of course, acknowledging the previous census members, Conti Kim and Chen Gao, they were very critical in kind of this work that we've been doing now for several years. Sheng and Zixiao for this lovely ASIC that I can demo or you guys can play with it. Yeah, and thanks to all of you for.
To start. Now we're good to start. So thanks for joining and after lunch session. So I'm going to give this like short tutorial kind of talk, and yeah, kind of like as an introduction to Loihi, and also present the latest work that we have in bringing set-based models to Loihi. So there is this really nice like perspective position.
Everybody knows this. Just go ahead.
Yeah, exactly, right? Yeah. Okay, so everybody knows it already. So we can kind of like just see how this translates to Loihi. In terms of like specialization, so like Loihi 2 is like designed to accelerate discrete time SNNs. This kind of like translates into a set of like architectural choices that we need to take into account when we design models for Loihi. First one is like that we just have a fixed point computation. So we need to turn our floating point models into fixed point. Second one is that we have no direct support for division. We need to like construct approximation for this if we need it, especially for like normalization layers. And then we have no support for all this kind of like weird function like square root, sigmoid, which are usually quite present in modern TL workloads. So we also need to kind of like take this into account and come up with like approximation for these. Last thing, we don't have direct support also for complex values and operations. So every time we have to do like complex multiplication or operation, we need to kind of like break it down like complex and real part. And of course, this is pretty relevant for all the state-space models kind of workloads. In terms of the parallelization, instead, so Loihi is basically like a mesh of cores. We have 120 what we call like neural cores. Each core can run multiple neurons in parallel. The actual number of neurons that you can run like depends on the complexity of the neuron, like how much memory you need, how much memory is like in the synapses. So that is all like programmable. And And then like the communication between the neurons like happens through this network on chip, which basically routes spikes from one core to the other.
You know what the die area is?
Good question. I think this is like in the specs, and it's probably online here. Right, and then we all like the course like have support for like so this programmable neurons, which like with the microcoded update, but we also have support for like sparse matrix vector multiplication and convolution. In terms of like how we then program things on Loihi at a very high level, we can kind of like break down the computation in like synaptic computation. So what everything then involves like a matrix vector multiplication or a convolution. And then the results are like summed into a dendritic accumulator and then processed by a neuron, which we can program with like an assembly language. Each neuron can also have multiple DAs, and so have some sort of like the neuron will basically like code for the element-wise steps in the network, and then we produce some spikes, like one or multiple spikes.
But do you write language? Do you write code on the cores? Do you write C code for the cores?
You write assembly code. For assembly code.
Okay.
So yeah, it is tricky to get like you really need to like get down to the machine level.
And fixed function sets of units that you have to program to operate together.
Yes. So what you really need to program in the end is like a neuron update, which gives you like all the element-wise operation in the model.
So
yes.
Maybe you said it, but can we have multiple dendrites or?
Yes, we can have multiple dendrites and also multiple spike out.
The assembly manages all 8192 neurons, right?
No. So the way we program it is like we have an assembly, like you can have different neuron families. So each neuron family is like defined by one microcode kind of program. And so the microcode program is like, you can imagine it as like doing the update for a single neuron.
So you kind of write like a function or a couple of functions, and for each neuron you call that function.
Yes.
Is it SIMD also, or is it one instruction memory?
No, it's not simply. So it's like
they're all independent.
Yes.
Little CPUs. Not even CPU, very specialized CPU.
Exactly. Yes. I mean the core like
microcode.
They're like programmable finite state machines.
Yeah. With functions that you can organize.
Okay.
And then the core can process multiple neurons in parallel, but it's not SIMD, right? Because if you want to support sparsely at very like granular level, that's the only.
But you could write loops and nested loops and things like that, or not? No.
Yeah, I mean you can have jumps right in there.
Okay.
So the question is, do you have branches like in the ISA?
Yes.
It's in other words, it's very different than not Spinnaker. It's very different than Spinnaker because Spinnaker was just really ARM cores.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, it's different. Okay.
Yeah, and you can code it in C code, so it's much higher level of abstraction. Any additional points here? Okay. So of course, like kind of like Loihi like came way before transformers, was not designed for transformers. So we have no direct support for matrix multiplication, even if like of course you can break that down like matrix vector multiplication stages, but this is really inefficient. So we're kind of like left out of the game of like this big large models. But then when all these kind of like linear RNNs started to kind of catch up and demonstrate that you can first of all like match the accuracy with transformers just with linear RNNs, that you can train them very well, and that they have like good properties at inference time. This kind of like gave us a way to kind of like say, okay, so now we can also tackle this kind of like large scale problems like LLMs and so on. So what we did is like we started with a very simple like SSM architecture, the S5. You're probably familiar with the equations. So these are like diagonalized equations for the recurrent update. All of A, B, and C are complex matrices. So we have to break them down into like real and imaginary component to kind of like then do the update in the synapses.
You can point with your mouse.
I can point with my mouse. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, it's much better.
So A, B, and C are complex, and so we need to break them down in the as I said, two components to actually like implement this on the chip. So the idea was like, let's start with a simple architecture, put together the pieces, and then we can kind of like iterate from here. Like we can build on top of this to like demonstrate larger models. The task that we chose like is kind of like really kind of like we already know as a good match with the chip, and we saw that like audio is like a big space in like neuromorphic for obvious reasons. So you have streaming processing, you have like temporal continuity, you have a lot like hopefully you want low latency, so there are like all set of properties that are really desirable for neuromorphic. So we selected this task, which is basically audio denoising task. You have like a like someone is speaking in the recording, some noise in the background, and so you can the target is basically to like put down the noise. So we set up this training pipeline, which tailors the S5 architectures to the chip. It's done in like a sequential way. So we first start like just training a simple like default floating point model, and then we do in one shot, we do quantization aware training, iterative pruning, and verification, such that we get like a sparse weights, sparse activations model that is like then closer to what we can actually run efficiently on the chip. It is quite nice to like, so we initialize the training from this like dense checkpoint, and all of these modifications can be done in a single like fine-tuning run. And yeah, so this is like quite nice to see that you don't need to like do this in like several steps.
What's railification? I never heard that.
So railification, we have like basically like you first of all like you change the activations from JLU, which is the standard S5 architecture, to ReLU, and you can also like add additional ReLUs to like sparsify, especially the pre-activations of the linear layers, which will like really bring down the amount of computation that you need to do. So if you look at the S5 architecture, like we see that most of the computation, like
I can't read it; it's too small. But yeah.
Okay, I mean, I get it, but it's too small for me as well. But yeah, in general, like most of the computation like happens in the linear layer. Like you can basically all the blue boxes are like linear blocks, right? So yeah, like 90% of the computation like happens in the linear components. So if you sparsify the pre-activations to the linear components, you really bring down like the max a lot.
Is there any performance penalty from like dropping out the JLU to ReLU?
Accuracy penalty?
Yeah, accuracy.
This is a great question, and so what we see here is like we compare like do a scaling analysis for like the dense model with like dense activation, dense weights, in the sparse models with sparse weights and activations, which are the two lines we see here in the two colors. So what we see is basically like we can kind of do two kind of comparisons. Like the first one, which is really common in the kind of like sparsity literature, is take a model, prune it, and see how much we gain in terms of performance. Like so, let's how much we reduce the compute, but also how much we hurt accuracy, right? And this is basically like the diagonal error that we see here. Okay. So what we found is that usually in like most sparsity papers, like what you have is that the models are really over-parameterized to begin with, and so when you prune them, you have like no hit on accuracy like at all, because like the model was just large to begin with. So if you instead like do this comparison like at the on the scaling curve, it's like clear that there is actually a trade-off between like the sparsity you can get and the accuracy drop that you observe. On the other side, it's also interesting to like kind of like compare models at the ISO accuracy. And so like you scale up both the dense and the sparse, and like you see at each level of accuracy, you can select like a couple of like dense and sparse and see how much compute you need to run both. And what we see, so this is basically like the horizontal arrow that we have here. What we see is that, yes, so we can get some efficiency gains from sparsity, roughly 2x. This is like pruned to 90%. So you actually need to increase the like width of the network quite a lot to kind of like recover accuracy in the settings. But what you get in the end is still more efficient in theory than the dense counterpart. And yeah, so this is like compares to max, which is the kind of like amount of compute in the memory.
For this data set, how big of a deal is 1 dB? Like I have no reference.
Like the accuracy, like metric.
Yeah.
Yes. So like basically what you see like in the dashed line is the like state of the art, and so everything like above like 13, 14 is like quite good.
I see. So kind of all of these models are pretty good.
They're pretty good. Yes, but like still like there's like a noticeable difference like in the spectrum. Right.
Just a quick question. So you've got like 1, 2, 3, 4 in orange, and you've got up to 12 in green.
Yes.
So what is the 12 equivalent on the orange curve? what would that look like? I mean,
I don't know what those numbers are.
I think it's because he's got these mapped 3 to 3, right? So I think that's the 3 models sparsified.
Yes. Yes, so the
Goes
number,
from the red 3, the orange 3 to the green or blue 3, depending on your perspective.
yes, so the number there like basically like gives you the size of the unpruned network, right? So it's basically like the width of the original width of the network. Yes, like if you also like put the like up to 12 in the dense side, like you end up with like way more max. So it will be like out of the.
Sure, I'm just wondering about the accuracy, right? Is it,
like no, it also saturates. Yes, yes.
That's what I was wondering.
Yeah, and so kind of like this gives in kind of like direction I was mentioning. So like if you keep scaling both cores at some point, like you will basically see that you prune with no loss in accuracy. But that's not interesting, right? Because that model was too large to begin with, basically. Okay. So next point is like we can also then take these models and put on like a relevant platform. We compare like the sparse model on Loihi to a dense equivalent model on the Jetson. And here we have like 2 inference setups. The first one, which is a token by token, which basically means that we want to like process each observation of the audio like towards through the old network before we process the next incoming observation. Is like done to minimize latency. And since we use like a STFT transform on the audio, basically we cannot wait for the second one to come in to process the first one. Otherwise, we'll have a latency that is like beyond what we can like notice like in the latency basically of the audio. So we see in this setup, like Loihi really has like a huge advantage, like both in terms of like latency and energy. Of course, the GPU is like underutilized in this setting, so it's not really good kind of like hardware backend for this kind of task. If we then look into the like sample by sample processing, so we do basically pipelining on the chip. We have like the entire like tokens, the entire layers processed in parallel. It's kind of like visible here. What we have is that we're like the gap between the two like closes. So you have like, but we're still outperforming. So yeah, this of course like improves the efficiency, especially on the GPU side, because you have all the data like already available, and then you can parallelize across the sequence length basically. We also have a demo. I don't know how well this will. Can you hear the audio? Let's see.
Is it running remotely on the hardware?
No, so this is recorded just to.
Oh, it's a video.
Okay, yeah, so we can't really hear the audio apparently, but you can still, yeah. So to give you an idea, like this is like the setup that we have for the demo. So you can connect remotely to the chip, but also like if you have the chip, like there, like you can also set this up. You can upload like a generic audio file, will like play back the noisy audio, and then in the meantime we'll set up, load the network into the chip, stream all the audio and like get the like noisy the cleaned one back. What you see here, like it takes roughly 30 seconds to like upload the audio sample, load the model on the chip, do the inference, and get the model back. In real time, like we tested this with like Ethernet streaming the input, and basically like to process 30-second audio file takes like 10 seconds. So it's like way beyond real time, basically. Yeah, it's a shame that I cannot play back the audio, but you can roughly see from the spectrogram that it's like really, like there's a lot of noise, which is really structured, which is like then polished in the cleaned up version. Okay, so yeah, so this is what I had for the talk. We can also do a deep dive into the code if it's interesting, but I don't know.
So can I ask a dumb question? I mean, the Loihi, the spikes are not spikes. They're really just byte values, right? They're really analog values. It's really like an ANN, asynchronous, semi-asynchronous ANN. Are they really binary spikes?
So we have graded spikes. So are like
Yeah, but they're basically just values,
Yes.
right? Scale of values, 8-bit values or something.
16 values. The
16-bit
bits.
values
Yes.
that are sent.
Yeah. Yes.
I also got a question for the quantization. Like, so
Yep.
how do you do like the layer norms and biases, stuff like that? If you only have low precision kind of fixed point that.
Yeah, so what we use is batch norm. In this model, we also have an implementation for RMS norm. I mean, batch norm is easy because like you compute it like 1 over the, you can compute like 1 over the scale like offline and then just do a multiplication on the chip.
Basically a scalar multiplication.
Yes,
I see.
right. With the RMS norm, like we have like basically there's a separate neuron which aggregates all the value and then like sum all the pairs and then like approximates the division with another one. Yes, it works, but it introduces like quite a lot of error usually. So quantization over training fixes this a little bit. On the other side, you don't want to have like too many RMS norms. That's why we moved from the matmul-free implementation that we had, which has like tons of RMS norms, to the IGRN because has way fewer RMS norms.
Gotcha. It's a very nice result. Loihi 2 is a pretty big chip, right? Is this one Loihi 2 chip?
Yes. So this is
not
like,
multi-chip.
This one is these results are a single chip. Yes.
But this is a big chip. Loihi 2 is a big piece of silicon.
Not really. I mean, it's like I don't know how.
14 square millimeter.
Intel 4.
Oh, only 4 square millimeter.
Intel 4. Sorry, and that was on an old process, 28 nanometer.
And there's also like there's also a version with Intel 3.
I mean, but how much of this? I think it's a rather expensive chip for a wearable or something, right? It's on the big side. But anyway, how much of the chip are you occupying to do this? Just this denoising.
So this denoising, like we spread this out, we spread the network out to get like low latency, and we occupy like 30% of the chip.
How much?
30%.
30%. So it's occupying 30% of the chip to do one audio signal processing task.
Yes.
So it's expensive still.
I mean, you can really break like you can also compress it like down to like 10 cores and do like 10% of the chip, which like for latency like purposes we just spread it out and like parallelize a bit more to get better latency.
Did you what was the system? What was the system level power consumption? I mean, of course, the board that supports Loihi 2 has a lot of other stuff on it too, right?
I mean, this is like really like sub-watt kind of like
it's
energy.
Watt, but it's not sub microwatt, right, or milliwatt.
So, I mean, you can roughly. I mean, you have 1
microjoules per token.
Yes.
It's still how many tokens a second? No, but it doesn't have to run at 130,000 tokens a second. Right?
It's roughly 1,000 tokens per second. No.
1,000 tokens times 10 microjoule.
Sorry, 100 tokens per second in terms of like real-time performance on the audio.
There's been some other projects where they actually measured power and Loihi for doing certain tasks, and it was a lot less granular than this. And it was still, yes, it was in the milliwatts.
Milliwatts, okay, the chip level.
Milliwatts, yeah. So I appreciate you only use 30% of the chip data to do this, neurons in order to do this. Did you consider perhaps trying to optimize to do even smaller? So for example, smaller and or larger, right? So I'm asking, did you look at ways that you could enhance the pipelining or the parallelization? Or conversely, did you look at, or I really do mean conversely, both to look at how you could use more of the chip and how you could use less?
Yes.
Perhaps using less could be, for example, specifically, if you look at virtualizing the neurons. So getting them to do specific signals for a slice of time and time slicing it for the next through one neuron.
Okay.
In other words, rather than waiting for scheduling to happen, you deliberately use spare cycles.
So it's not, so first of all, like Loihi is not clocked, right? So there are not 3 cycles.
Nice. So as soon as something's done, you could find something else.
Yes, but so the bottleneck is really like the memory that you have in the cores. So like you can pack as many neurons you want, but at a certain point, like you will run out of memory in the core, right? So that's kind of like give you like an upper bound of how many neurons you can put on a core.
Okay, so I'm in Toby mode at the moment. So why didn't you look at What, so then what's the barrier? Why not push the signal out? If the memory is the barrier, it's because you're holding some result state information. So why was it being held? Why
And
didn't you
weights.
just push it out straight away?
And weights. It's mostly weights that you have in memory and the internal state of the neurons. Because we have like recurrent neurons, so you need to alter state.
Okay, so if it's weights, then free it up by pushing it out.
You cannot, like, the memory is like statically mapped at compile time and it's just sitting there, right? So you map the layer to the.
You also said there were unused neurons on the chip, right?
Yes.
So those unused neurons also have memory, right?
Yes.
So you could move from one to another.
Yes, you can spread it out like as much as you want. At a certain point, like this will not be beneficial anymore because you will have like at the point you will have like increased traffic.
Right.
So the
So
traffic
the
will
question
be-
is, you know, where do you have the gap? Is it in the memory? Is it in the time? And if the problem is the memory, then you do have lots of spare bandwidth in terms of time. You could move weights between, you know, spare neurons, for example, or look for ways to optimize or virtualize.
So we have actually like work going on with Jason, like actually led by Jason, where we really like go into the details of like partitioning, mapping, like optimizing for different kind of metrics, like especially latency. What we observe is that there are like specific counters that you can look at, like in terms of like activity on a single core that you can use to then like spread that layer like more, and then bring down latency. What we also see, as I was saying, is that at a certain point, like that is not beneficial anymore because like the traffic on the network on chip will just like gives you like.
So I'm asking the question, yes, to look at how you could use more of a chip or how you could virtualize and use less of the chip, because I'm trying to get to where's the data that tells what the bottlenecks were. The bottlenecks, for example, the memory, as you say, and so you could have put, you know, been more efficient or had a lot more throughput if you could push in and out memory. Is there an IO sweet spot for the amount of memory? You know, so think of a bigger picture, like you're helping to educate next generation.
Yes.
Loihi 4.
Yeah.
Right.
So, I mean,
so what you got, the data from this should also be not just, you know, how much more efficient we're than Jetson. Everyone knows Jetson sucks, especially me. But you know, where were the issues in Loihi 2? Right.
Yes.
Do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Does that make more sense?
Yeah, so I mean the issue is like always the memory, mostly always the memory reads, so that gives you kind of.
So I have a slide talking about that.
Yes.
David, I have an entire talk for you.
Yes, tons of like.
I have an entire talk for you after this, yeah. Or not after this, but like in the future.
We are like working this, it's like unpublished results. So yes, we have that.
Yeah, so a little tired, you know, it's been more than a decade now. We've seen, you know, Jetson versus Loihi. Done that, know that.
We also have like lower level characterization results that we don't publish because these are like most for like.
And it's not really an apples to apples comparison because the Jetson's going to burn about 10 watts, and no matter what you do, 10 watt computer, right? 10 or 20 watts.
And it's going to need a fan.
Yeah.
So there is also like this is
it's
like
intended for massive batch mode. It only, you know, those GPUs are only good when you send big batches of stuff to them anyway.
That's a good point, and that's also what we got in the review for the paper. What we did is like compare the impact of batching in both architectures. On Loihi, we don't really have support for batching because we cannot do like matrix multiplication, right? So the way you realize batching is like replicating the network several times on the chip and then pushing like parallel sequences like through the network in parallel, right?
I would expect Jetson to.
Oh, wait, let him finish first. Hold on, David. I want to hear what he has to say.
Yes, so basically like what we see is that both chips actually
are like the batch size on this axis.
Batch size on the x-axis, and then on the y-axis we have double axis. We have both latency and so total latency to process like increasing like batch size, and also the energy efficiency in terms of like energy per sample, right? What we see is basically like both boards are like highly underutilized because like you increase the batch size and you get no latency like at all. So the total latency stays flat. And then we also see that the latency consumption goes down for both. So basically the energy efficiency like increases proportionally to the batch size for both architectures. This can be explained by the fact that Loihi also has like static power, right? So what happens is that if you increase the batch size, you're basically like spreading the static power like more over the samples that you have in parallel, basically.
Yeah, very similar plots to this in the Delta RNN papers. You know, I guess you've seen those papers from Chang, right? If you haven't seen them, you should look at them because they had also these kind of batch size effects, and we were also comparing with GPU and little TPUs and things.
So what I was going to add with two things. One is Jetson is not a GPU, like you would think of as an adding card GPU.
It's a GPU.
It's considerably less L1, L2, L3 cache.
Yeah.
Considerably less.
Yes. But these are small workloads, right?
Yeah, so the batch size curve for a GPU would be very different than Jetson.
What do you expect to see? Different than this?
Really worse for small batch sizes and really much better for bigger batch sizes.
Yeah.
Because to I think where you're getting at, what happens is that you end up starting to reuse the local caches a lot more with larger batch sizes. And then it becomes a lot more efficient because then you're not pushing and pulling from them.
Yes.
No, I mean, with larger batches, you're reusing the weights more often. You're reusing the weights.
Yes, but within the cache, within the GPU. And that doesn't happen as much in Tegra, Jetson, as it does in a standalone adding card GPU.
No, fundamentally, correct me if I'm wrong, the reason and the whole reason GPUs are successful in deep learning and the whole reason that batches were introduced in the very first place is simply because in a batch, you can apply the same weights in a GPU core to a bunch of activations.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know, it's not for any machine learning reason that it's better to use big batch sizes or anything. It's not better. It's better to use small batches.
Yeah.
The only reason they have batches at all in GPUs is that you can reuse the weights.
That's correct.
That's the only reason.
Yeah. And when you boil it down
the machine learning people flipped it around. They didn't understand the hardware.
When you boil it down to why in the hardware, it's because of the cache locality of the data.
That's right.
It's a cache.
Just for memory reuse. That's the only reason batches are useful.
Yeah, agreed. And so what I'm saying is for Jetson, the cache sizes are much smaller than a standalone GPU. So you would see a much more dramatic difference, for a GPU than you would for a Tegra.
What would actually my mind be interesting to see is that a comparison to a lower power device, because the Jetson is already quite power angry, right? So if you wanted to compare
Not in the GPU level.
yeah, okay. I mean, of course, but you're not going to run audio denoising on H100, right?
It's like 1/20th of the GPU power, but
Still,
I agree.
If you want to do audio denoising at the edge, most likely then what's this like?
No, but especially for audio signal processing, you don't want batches at all. You want to go single sample or single audio frame at a time.
I mean, you can argue that perhaps in modern
in multi-microphone, you might want small
exactly.
batches.
You can want small batches, and this is also why we did this.
If you're running a data center, you're dealing with lots of clients.
No, on device. We're talking about edge here.
Yeah, but I'm saying the GPU is designed for data center, multiple clients, so you do want that stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm really excited to see your stuff. But this is great. This is fantastic.
Oh, plan one.
Okay, next year
sometime.
How long did it take you to write the code for all of this, in assembly?
So the actual implementation on the chip took 2 months roughly. Writing a first draft is really easy, right? But that's verifying getting bit accurate between what you have in simulation and you used to train and on the chip is really takes quite some time.
Yeah, and it'd be really great to see hey, this would have been so much easier, so much better if it had this instruction and that instruction, or this operation, or that data movement, or
what I would say is what really would have made our life easier as more on the software side is to have a really good quantization library, which
you're saying on the algorithm
quantization aware training library.
Yes. So if you basically and this is something we are actually building to have quantized kernels that we can run on GPU during training, which should are bit accurate with what runs on the chip.
That doesn't exist yet?
I mean, it's standard now in PyTorch, I think, to have these quantization aware training.
Yes, but you really need to tailor that to the quantization that happens on the chip.
Exactly, Loihi is capable of. Yeah, you have to customize it.
Yes.
Subclass it, right?
And Torch doesn't have support for a good support for quantization.
Yeah.
They use something that is called fake quantization, which is not one-to-one mapping on the chip.
So yeah.
Yeah.
So asterisks is in the
I see.
available support. Basically, you have to fix it.
Exactly.
I mean, the fake quantization is not really the issue because during training you're going to do fake quantization anyway.
Yeah, but once you deploy it.
Once you deploy, of course, you want to do static quantization.
Yeah.
First of all, which also it's not really that supported on Torch really well. So it's static quantization, you want to fix the scales, right? To be like power of two such that you can do this, like it's the chips on the chip.
It's a nightmare.
Okay, so if you had a wish list slide, if you had a wish
Range
list
load.
slide, quantization libraries would be
Yes.
would be high.
No,
What else?
floating points, what they want.
Floating,
Yeah, no.
I mean, but if the integer is like fixed point is what gives you like the energy advantage. The fixed point computation is what gives you like the energy advantage.
not necessarily.
No, low precision floating point with big dynamic range, but low precision.
that I
That's
agree.
It doesn't cost you any more. The arithmetic is basically the same cost.
But put up both options. Okay, you don't need to have the Toby version of the slides that in the one for everyone else. But Toby and I have talked about floating point a lot. So, but okay, apart from quantization, perhaps floating point, what else would you say would be high wish list? This like would have been much easier if you had X.
Some sort of like local kind of argmax.
Sorry, one more time.
Some
argmax max function.
Yes. So what we do like in the DAs,
Hardware
the
max.
derivative accumulator, like we always sum. What would be also interesting to see some sort of argmax that you can do.
No, you want a hardware softmax, right?
I mean, yes, softmax as well.
Like
but
softmax, but you're happy with argmax.
It has different applications. So the softmax is really important, like especially if you want to do LLMs, right? Because you need to like sample from the probability, so you need to be able to do the softmax. So that's one. But perhaps you can use the embedded CPUs to get away with it. The argmax, like the motivation for that is really to have like sparse activations, something like top K activations, or like small domains. In that you can really like works well during training, but then of course on the chip, as of now, like there's no way of implementing this efficiently.
Hardware max pooling, basically, right? The equivalent of hardware max pooling.
But max pooling we have, right? Because that's like you have like the conv layers, like you can do this, yes.
I see. You need to know who is the max, not just what is the max. Yeah, who
Exactly.
and what is the max.
Exactly. Yes.
Just mainly for sparse activations.
What?
Like for sparse activations. I
Like tree
you
or
zero out like
yeah.
everything except for the top K.
Exactly. And this has kind of connections to like mixer of experts, all this kind of like, yeah.
Interesting.
Or kind of like
Generalization of winner take all.
exactly, yeah. To have like dynamic, but more structured kind of like sparsity.
Do you think you really need softmax or just another?
It's nothing that gets attention.
Activation of the nervous system.
So I mean that I don't care, honestly.
And also very useful, right? We discussed this the other day that this kind of if the softest max is just the average,
Yes.
you know, and then you make it harder and harder, and you pick out these bumps.
Yes.
Finally, you have just the biggest one, right? It's a very continuous thing. It happens all over the nervous system, all the way from the eye and cortex, everywhere you do comparisons of neurons with themselves over some local region. That's the max. And also that was the breakthrough that led to the capacity expanse on the Hopfield network. To add a softmax on the output, increase the capacity by exponentially compared to the original Hopfield net. That simple realization took 30 years. I mean, we discussed this before, right? To figure out to put a softmax on the Hopfield network output, increase the capacity enormously. Why that took 30 years, you know, people, I remember clearly the first few years of Hopfield, there were a bunch of people that were just computing capacity and measuring capacity of Hopfield network. They never had the idea, which should have come from us neuromorphs, that you add a softmax. That's like a no-brainer, right? To compare these guys with each other.
That you can also translate.
Yeah, we should have
layer
suggested,
norm.
right? It took like, but still 30 years for somebody to realize, and to realize that these associative memories are actually useful.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
That's the first time they became useful. Before, in the early days, I remember it was all about solving the traffic salesman problem, stuff like that. It was all, you know.
Okay, so
anyway,
fixed quantized library or floating point, softmax, hardmax. What else?
If you go in a different domain, so you go into LLMs, for example, some sort of like on-chip IO, like an IO chiplet where you can support some sort of like lookup table.
But doesn't this fancy Loihi 2 have a DRAM interface?
No.
It does have DDR3. No, this is Loihi 2, not Spinnaker 2.
Yeah, we don't have
getting
to.
confused.
So and that's
By IO, do you mean a memory interface, or do you mean
That's DRAM.
yes, memory interface. Yes, to have like at least some sort of like big dense memory interface.
Guessing you're running out of local memory on the core, basically.
And not necessarily the core level. It can also be like the chip level.
No, but I'm saying, but because you're running out of memory at
No, because there are some ways that we don't need to parallelize over cores and for which we just need lookup tables. Like the example for this is like embedding layers in LLMs. This is just a single lookup that you do when you stream into the network.
That's it. I was talking to Steve, I think, about Mamba, and part of the problem there is the weights are fixed at compile time, right? This is also going to David's question about moving weights around dynamically. Do you think that's an issue for different models?
No, moving them around just for load balancing, I mean.
You know, or whatever. Like if you want to have anything that's dynamically calculated on the fly.
Well, I was thinking just to move things around so you could virtualize, but
I mean,
but you're thinking something else as well, which is also interesting.
Yeah,
I mean, there are algorithms that do that, right?
Yeah, and if you have the general ability to move weights in and out, then yes, you could do lots of different things.
Yes, so that.
But I think that your point about the memory interface wasn't necessarily for moving weights in and out. It was for lookup tables specifically.
Yes.
So how would you access this lookup table? You would.
So what
Pull it into the core and then use it, or you would go reference some address to get some value.
You can use like perhaps you can have some sort of like pre-processing like preprocessor there that like generates spikes from this lookup table that then goes into the node.
I mean, lookup tables for the activation functions and transcendentals.
No, I mean that you would ideally also have at the core level, right?
So,
but this is like more for like global kind of things. Like in LLMs, like you give the token, which like is a discrete value, and then you do just a lookup in like gigantic lookup table. And so you want to put this value.
How many neurons are getting used to represent a vocabulary for 100,000?
Exactly.
Right. So it's really just your vocabulary embedding that.
Exactly.
So if I was to boil it down to something really brain dead stupid, it could be base address is the beginning of the lookup table, offset address is the index into the lookup table, bam, that's your value.
Exactly.
So, and that's it. So you simply are calculating the address for.
It's just a big memory.
Yes, it's just a big. It's what I mean. Certain things where you don't need compute, you just need memory, right? So there's no.
You're saving the compute. Yeah, you can do amazing things with lookup tables.
Yeah.
Amazing things.
Thank you, Alessandro.
Yep.
This
Thank you for
nice.